Mr. President, we've been discussing the value of having a multi-year transportation bill, a highway bill moving through the Senate, something that I too would like to see. But as with everything that we do around here, it's important how we do it. And when you have a multi-year highway bill, it's important to ask the question, how are we paying for that? Well, one of the considerations that is in front of this body is to pay for $9 billion of this multi-year highway bill through a sell-off of crude oil from our Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPRO, or the SPR. Well, Mr. President, I have come before this floor several times already during this debate to try to convince colleagues that this is exactly the wrong way to address our transportation priorities by selling off a national energy security priority, basically an insurance policy that we have for this country, an insurance policy to ensure that at the time that we might be most vulnerable with our energy supplies, we have reserves. We have a safety net that we can turn to in the event of an emergency brought about by hurricane or natural disaster, or whether it is a man-made disaster, war, or something else that has caused global disruption. Mr. President, in short, it boggles my mind that we would be willing, so willing and almost eager to tap into this strategic asset for such short-term and limited gain. In the absence of supply disruption that justifies releasing oil from the SPR, selling our strategic reserves only worsens an existing competitive disadvantage for our American oil producers. As you know, Mr. President, we have in place an outdated 40-year-old plus ban on our ability to sell our domestic crude oil overseas. We are limited in our ability to export that. I think that that is a wrong and outdated policy, and am working with many, including the occupant of the chair, to lift this outdated policy. I've introduced legislation to do just that. We'll actually have a bill before the Banking Committee tomorrow to again shed some light on the fact that it is so incredibly inconsistent from a policy perspective that we would be talking about lifting the sanctions on Iran, allowing Iran to access the broader global market so that they can sell their oil reserves, so that they can take advantage of the resources that will come to them to do who knows what mischief, while at the same time further prohibiting in this country our oil producers that opportunity to access the global market. By lifting the sanctions on Iran and keeping the oil export ban in place in this country, we are effectively sanctioning our own U.S. oil producers. That's wrong. Well, again, we're working to address that, but we're in a situation currently, American companies cannot sell oil to the same countries that we let Iran sell its own oil to, and now with this proposal in front of us to sell off some 101 million barrels of oil from the SPRO, we're potentially going to saturate a market that is already oversupplied. Think about what that means to those in Oklahoma, where the rig count in this country right now is down by half of what it was just last year. We're at a 5-year low with that. Our market is oversaturated. Mr. President, this morning I introduced yet another white paper out of the Energy Committee. It's entitled A Turbulent World in Defense of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. And this white paper outlines some of the history behind the SPRO and why I feel so strongly and why I will continue to come to this floor to oppose the sale of 101 million barrels of oil from the SPRO to pay for a portion of this highway bill. Let's take a look at the history of when we have had emergency drawdowns. We have had exactly 3 emergency drawdowns ever. The SPRO, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, has been in place since the mid-70s. We had a drawdown in 1991 with Desert Storm. We had a drawdown in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit. And then in Libya in 2011 during their civil war. So, Mr. President, this red right here is the 101 million barrels that this legislation seeks to sell off. 101 million barrels, the total amount of sales from emergency drawdowns ever combined is 58.9 million barrels. Mr. President, what we're talking about doing here is in one act to take 101 million barrels and put it out there on the market. In all the years, in the 40 years that we have had access to reserves in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, we have had 3 emergency drawdowns, 1 in hurricane, 2 in the event of disruption for war, and together all 3 of those totaled just shy of 60 million barrels. And yet this proposal is 101 million barrels. We have exchanged oil out of the SPRO a total of 12 times. This was in Hurricanes Isaac, Katrina, Lily, Ivan, Gustav, and Ike. We've created a home heating oil reserve. We've closed some ship channels for accidents. We've imported oil from Mexico. All of these exchanges, all of those exchanges, not drawdowns, but all of those totaled only 68.9 million barrels. Again, we're talking about 101 million barrel sale. We've also done test sales. We've done 3 test sales in 1985, in 1990, and then in 2014. We've also closed down a reserve site, Weeks Island. We've sold off some barrels for that. And the total for all of that activity was 15 million barrels for all 4 sales. And, Mr. President, I've had people tell me, oh, don't overreact here. Don't overreact. This is no different than what we did with the 2 sales in 1996 for federal deficit reduction. So let's look at that chart. 1996, we had a deficit reduction in May, that's the blue, and then in October, we did further reductions, the green. So look at that. Both of those sales totaled 23 million barrels. So again, back in 96, total of 23 million. What we're looking at with this legislation, again, is a sell-off of 101 million barrels today. That's not even a fair comparison. Selling 101 million barrels would be the equivalent of 60% of all of the oil that has ever left the Spro. A total of 161 million barrels we have effectively taken out, moved off out of the Spro since it was created in 1975, about 40 years ago. So we've had emergency drawdowns, we've had 3 of those, we've had the exchanges that I talked about, and we've had test sales. And then we had the sales in 1996 with the federal deficit reduction. You take all of that together, everything in the history of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve that we've ever sold off or exchanged, it brings you to 161 million barrels, and now we're talking about 101 million barrels sale, 60%. I think it's important to put this into context because this is a big, fat deal. And yet we're acting like this is just another withdrawal from your ATM. Just go down, you check the balance, I got enough money in there, must be okay. Well, Mr. President, let's talk about the strategic environment that we're operating in right now. There's a nominal drawdown capacity of 4.4 million barrels per day. And I mentioned this the last time I was on the floor. The drawdown capacity is subject to some discussion in terms of what we're actually able to pump out. And this is why we do the test sales, is to make sure that it works as it was designed. The Secretary of Energy, Secretary Moniz, has suggested that our distribution rate, our ability to move this once we take it out, is significantly less than this nominal drawdown capacity of 4.4 billion barrels, or excuse me, 4.4 million barrels, due to congestion and changes in midstream infrastructure. And this is one of the reasons why I've been banging the lectern here, and Senator Cantwell, my ranking member on the Energy Committee, has also been joining me in saying this is not appropriate for us to be doing this. We've got significant maintenance issues within this SPRO that we need to address, somewhere between $1.5 billion and $2 billion that it's going to take to address some of the shortcomings that we have within the SPRO, the maintenance and operations aspect of it. So there's a study underway as we speak to determine the right size of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. What do we need to do in terms of maintenance? But if we go ahead and we sell off 60% of what we have done historically throughout the whole lifetime of the SPRO to fund a highway bill for 6 years, again, it just causes you to wonder, why are we doing this? So again, the strategic environment and the drawdown capacity that we have. We've got a pretty volatile world out there. I think we know that. We have unplanned disruptions, unplanned production outages, if you will, in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Nigeria, Libya, Iran. These are around 2.5 to 3 million barrels per day. Now, these are some pretty tense regions of the world. I don't think anyone would dispute that. On this next chart, what you see here is our drawdown rate of 4.4 or thereabouts is greater than the daily production of Iran, Iraq, Venezuela, Nigeria, Algeria, or Libya. Now, I don't think anybody would suggest that any of these countries here that are in the blue exude stability or security. And then look at the transit choke points. A drawdown rate of 4.4 million barrels per day is bigger in fairness, than the capacity of some of the other areas that would be clearly noted as these choke points. You've got the Panama Canal at the end, the Turkish or the Danish Straits. You've got Bab el-Mandab off the coast of Yemen. But Mr. President, if something went wrong in more than one of these critical parts of the supply chain at once, we could be overtaken by upheaval in the global oil market without much recourse. Our ability to respond would be dramatically lessened. And 4.4 million barrels per day is less than the oil that transships the Suez Canal and its accompanying pipeline. It's a fraction of the oil that goes through the Straits of Malacca or the Straits of Hormuz, which move about 15 to 17 million barrels each day. And this is my point here. My central point is our Strategic Petroleum Reserve is a tremendous national security asset, and we need it because the world is just simply more turbulent. And I've been told, well, but look at what's happening domestically. We're importing less, we're producing more, and so therefore we don't really need all of this. We don't need this safety net. You know, we cannot immunize ourselves from global events and just suggest that somehow or other we need it less. You know, it's like you've been going to the doctor and you get a clean bill of health. You come home and you say, okay, now I don't need life insurance, I don't need health insurance because the doctor just said you're fine. You know what? The world out there right now is not fine, and we know that. At a time when spare capacity is low and the global threat environment is heightened, selling 101 million barrels of America's strategic reserve to pay for legislation that makes almost no contribution to improving our energy security, I think is just a foolish error of historic proportions. I will just restate what we would be doing if we move forward with the pay for as has been outlined. We would be conducting the largest sale in the history of the reserve, the largest sale in the history of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve since it was created in 1975, greater than all of the previous emergency drawdowns combined. We're going into hurricane season. We don't know what may be coming at us in the Middle East. And yet, we are proposing to pay for a short-term fix to the Highway Trust Fund with a cash out, a buyout, Mr. President, of unprecedented proportions. I said last time I was on the floor, this is like cashing out your homeowner's insurance to pave your driveway. It's not the right pay for. And again, I too want to make sure that we do right by our transportation infrastructure. It is important. It is about jobs. It is about the strength of our economy. But we are also obligated to make sure that the decisions that we take here in this Senate, in this Congress, are there to provide for our security as a nation. And I want to know that if we need these ready resources, we haven't moved precipitously to sell them off. And I will just remind my colleagues, last time I checked this morning, the price of oil is hanging about $50 a barrel. Is this really a good time to be selling off at $50 a barrel? So, Mr. President, I thank you for your attention. I think those of us who have been following this issue with great interest are concerned and are conflicted, because we want to make sure that we do right by our highway systems, but we also want to make sure that we do right by our national energy security. And selling off 101 million barrels of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is foolhardy. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.